Okay, so we are going to talk about solving complex quadratics by taking square roots. We did a whole lesson on taking square roots, right? We're going to do the same thing today, except we're going to add an additional layer. So, yesterday we talked about I squared, and what do we know about I squared? It equals -1, right? We can replace I squared with -1. So if I give you the square root of -1, any guess what that's going to equal?
The square root of I squared. Or
equals I squared.
square root of I.
Okay, so let's see. If I solve this, how do I solve for I? Take the square root. So I equals the square root of -1, which means the square root of -1 is I. I is imaginary. So up until today, you have been told that you cannot take square roots of negative numbers. Okay? Yes. That's about to change. So we're going to take the square root of -16. Now, without freaking out, what's the square root of 16? 4. And the square root of -1 is I. So anytime... I'm very excited. Anytime you have a negative underneath a square root, you pull it out and it gets replaced with an I.
That makes sense because it's like a...
That's it.
So it's the same exact thing, you just put an I next to it.
Yes, because it has a negative.
Oh, that's easy.
Okay? So let's do this one.
Creepers.
So the square root of -24.
Didn't we just do this?
Yes.
Right.
This is like the warm-up.
2 and 6.
Okay. Well, for everyone who doesn't remember that it was in their warm-up, if I break it down, I get 6 and 4, 3 and 2, 2 and 2. So I'm pulling out a 2, right? What's left over? 6. And because it's a negative, we pull out an I. And the I is going to go after the 2, but before the square root.
Oh.
Now, if you pull it out and put it over here, remember when we were talking about, we're going to have a problem with it, or a problem like it. If you're not careful and you put the I here and your square root goes over the I, it's wrong. The I is on the outside of the square root. So it's just easier, so you don't get that mistake made, to put the I in the front of the square root. In front of the 2? I just said you can. So you can do 2 square root of 6 I, but you need to be very careful that that I is not underneath the square root. So in order to not make that mistake, it's easier if we just put it in front. Remember when we were talking about the problems that had, I'm just going to pretend like I have something. So it was like plus or minus 3, square root of 3, and then we added 2 to both sides. Do you remember when we did that? And I said we should write this as 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. I said you could also write it as plus or minus the square root of 3 plus 2, but you had to be very careful not to have the square root over that. It's just easier if you write it out front so you don't make that mistake. Okay, but if you write it like this, as long as that square root's not under, that's fine. I mean, it's not wrong. All right. So because we've had spring break, let's remember how to take square roots. Okay, so let's do this together. We should know this. You just took a test on it. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yep, we're going to add 9 to both sides. Where x squared equals 9. Then what? Take the square root. X equals
3 plus or minus 3. I think.
plus or minus 3. Do not forget your pluses and minuses. Yes, it will. Huh? Okay, so since you guys obviously know how to do that one, why don't you do this one? Silence says yes. All right, what'd you do first? Take the square root. Okay, so when I take the square root, I get x minus 9 equals plus or minus the square root of 15. Anytime you're solving and you take the square root, you have to have that plus or minus. But I still want x by itself. Add 9. And here's the type of problem up here that I was talking about. First of all, can I simplify the square root of 15? No, because it's 3 and 5 and there's no pairs. So x equals, where should that 9 go? Out front. Plus or minus
So you can't add 15?
the square root of 15. You cannot add 9 and 15 because 15 is underneath the radical. Okay, so I'm glad we did that because it looks like we needed a little refresher. Okay, so let's add another layer to this. So x squared plus 12 equals 0. Yeah, let's do it together. What should we do?
Subtract 12.
Okay. So you get x squared equals negative 12, right? Okay, now what? Square root. X equals plus or minus. So 12 breaks down to what?
6 and 2.
6 and 2 or 3 and 4 and then 2 and 2. So I have a pair of
2.
2s. What stays inside?
3.
Are you okay with that answer?
No, put I at the end.
You need to add your I because it's a negative 12. Anytime you have a negative, that I has to come out. That's as much as we're doing. You're just adding an I. If there's a negative. Okay, so you do this one. It's not going to be harder. It's because there's a negative underneath the square root. So you have to take that out and make it an I. Okay, so we're going to start by subtracting 11 from both sides, giving you 4x squared equals negative 5, right? Then what'd you do? Divide by 4. Now you're going to get the same answer, but there were some of you who made mistakes by square rooting first. Always get the squared term, x squared, y squared, whatever it is, by itself. Thank you. Okay, that gives me x squared equals negative 5 fourths. Now take the square root. So x equals plus or minus
I, the square root of 5.
What's the square root of 5?
Just 5.
There ain't no square root of 5, so we're going to leave it as the square root of 5.
I
And you pull out the I because the 5 is negative,
over 2.
and the square root of 4 is 2. You took the square root, or you took the square root before, yeah. Okay, and it's going to work, but there are some instances where it won't, so you need to go through this step. Get the squared term by itself, okay? Questions? Okay, so taking square roots, you might see on your homework where some have negatives inside and you have to pull out an I and some don't. Okay, not all of these problems you'll pull out an I. Okay, so just be very cautious of that.